On May 3, 1946, death row inmate Willie Francis felt 2,000 volts of electricity surge through his body in the execution chamber. Miraculously, he survived. But that's just one of many incredible stories about death row inmates who escape the clutches of death, even if only temporarily. And among them, there's a name that the U.S. justice system will never forget: Kenneth Smith. On November 17, 2022, Kenneth Smith entered Alabama's execution chamber. Despite the federal court's order to halt proceedings, Smith remained tightly strapped to the cold metal gurney. His life leading up to this moment began in the 1980s, when a pastor named Charles Sennett Sr. He was drowning in debt and conceived the idea of killing his wife, Elizabeth Sennett, to collect her life insurance money. He paid Smith and an accomplice named John Forrest Parker $1,000 each to complete the job. But crime is never perfect. Smith was arrested, convicted, and spent 33 years in a death row cell awaiting his execution. But when that day came, Smith didn't die. The three-person execution team stood beside them, holding syringes filled with lethal drugs. They stabbed Smith in the arm. Once, twice, 3 times. Vein not found. Smith screamed in pain, begging them to stop, but they didn't stop. They stabbed their hand, stab into the muscle. Blood is flowing freely. 4 hours passed like medieval torture. Finally, they flipped the stretcher bed over so Smith's feet were pointing toward the ceiling and his head was bowed toward the floor, like an inverted crucifixion. Smith recalled, "Their masks were covered in my blood. Finally, they hit the clavicle, trying to inject into the subclavian artery." Psychologically, Smith fell into a state of extreme panic. Prisoners who survived failed executions often faced severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a fear of unfinished death that caused them sleeplessness and haunting thoughts. Legally, Smith's lawyers immediately spoke out. Did this failed execution violate the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment? The court's answer, no. And Alabama decided to try a method never before used in the history of American executions: nitrogen hypoxia. All Smith needs to do is breathe and die. Alabama is not the only state that has failed to execute death row inmates by lethal injection. On September 15, 2009, the state of Ohio also faced a similar disaster when attempting to execute Romell Broom. Broom was born on June 4, 1956 in Muskegon, Michigan, before moving to Ohio at the age of 5 with his mother. Here, he befriended the wrong people and a path of crime opened up. In 1974, he started with highway robbery. It then escalated to rape and murder. But the case that led to his death sentence was the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Trina Middleton, a girl who was walking home with 2 friends after a football game in East Cleveland. DNA doesn't lie. Broom was sentenced to death by lethal injection. 2 hours. That was the time when the executioners were trying to insert the needle into Broom's vein. Each time he thrust, he groaned in pain. Finally, the Ohio authorities were forced to intervene and order a halt. They postponed it for a week. But a week turned into many years as Broom's lawyer fought the appeals. Broom even wrote a book about that terrifying experience, about the feeling of being tortured in the execution chamber, about the fear of knowing you're about to die but your body still hasn't given up. The date for the retrial is set for March 16, 2022. But on December 20, 2020, Romell Broom died from COVID-19 complications right on death row. He had tricked death, even if it was only for 11 more years. But when it comes to surviving execution, no method fails more often than hanging. And William Duell is proof of that. On November 24, 1740, Duell, a young man, was hanged at Tyburn, England, along with 4 other convicts for his complicity in the rape of Sarah Griffin. His body hung suspended for 20 minutes. As medical staff cut down and transported the body to the anatomy theater for dissection, no one suspected that Duell was still alive. A servant undressed him, placed the body on the operating table, and suddenly realized his chest was still moving slightly. The weak breath gradually became faster. A few hours later, Duell sat up and was able to speak. Medical science explains that the noose tightening around Duell's neck caused his brain to lack oxygen, leading to delirium. He doesn't remember anything about being hanged. The next day, his health had completely recovered. The British public was delighted, seeing it as a divine sign. Deuel was pardoned based on mental state, and the death sentence was commuted to penal transportation to North America. He lived the rest of his life in Boston and is believed to have died around 1805. On February 23, 1885, John Lee became the man they couldn't hang. Lee was born in England in 1864. At the age of 21, he was sentenced to death for murdering his employer, Mrs. Emma Case, in the very house where he worked. The evidence is frighteningly thin. Lee was the only male in the house on the night of the murder, plus a few cuts on his arm and an old criminal record. Lee maintains his innocence, but the court didn't believe it. The day of execution arrived. Lee stepped onto the platform, his head bound by a noose, a cloth bag covering his face. The executioner pulled the lever to open the trap door, but the door wouldn't open. He tried again. Still won't open. Third time. Still the same. It was a terrible embarrassment for the entire British justice system. The coroner intervened and ordered the execution to be stopped. Lee was taken back to his cell while they checked the mechanism. The strange thing is, when the test was unmanned, the hatch worked perfectly. But as soon as Lee stood up, it refused to open. Throughout the entire process, Lee remained remarkably calm. He said that faith in God would save him, and it seems that's what happened. The judge ultimately commuted the death sentence to life in prison. After years of appeals and new evidence suggesting other men might have been in the house that night, Lee was declared innocent and released in 1907. His fate after that remains a mystery. Some sources say he died in England during World War II, while others claim he went to America as a speaker and died in Milwaukee. Anyway, John Lee will always be remembered as the man they couldn't hang. But when it comes to miracles, no one can compare to Anne Green. On December 14, 1650, Anne, a servant from Oxfordshire, was hanged for infanticide. The truth is, Anne was seduced and made pregnant by Geoffrey Red, the nephew of the landlord, Sir Thomas Red. After 17 weeks, Anne miscarried. Terrified, she tried to hide the fetal remains but was discovered. The court convicted her of murder. Anne was hanged at Oxford Castle for 30 minutes. When she was cut down, her body was placed in a coffin and given to doctors at the University of Oxford for dissection to serve medical research. But Anne didn't die. For the next 24 hours, she lay in the coffin without food, water, and with almost no air. As the doctor prepared to make the incision, he detected a pulse. The body is moving. Doctors rushed to administer medication for hours before Anne could speak and move her limbs again. 3 days later, Sir Thomas passed away, and no one opposed Anne's pardon anymore. A group of rebellious men demanded to hang her again, but no one let them. Anne was set free, left the town, got married, had 3 children, and died peacefully in 1659. Willie Francis, an African-American teenager, was not so fortunate. On May 3, 1946, he survived the electric chair because the portable equipment was installed incorrectly by a drunken prison guard. Lawyer Bertrand de Blanc fought all the way to the Supreme Court presenting evidence of wrongful conviction. The gun, the bullet, and the victim Andrew Thomas's body all disappeared before the trial. But the court dismissed the appeal. On May 9, 1947, Francis was returned to the electric chair. This time, he's dead. His last words to the reporter were, "I will meet God in my Sunday pants and my Sunday heart." On September 22, 2022, Alabama failed again. This time, it's with Alan Eugene Miller. Miller was sentenced to death for killing 3 people, Lee Holdbrooks, Christopher Scott Yancey, and Terry Jarvis, in a 1999 paranoid episode. But when the execution team tried to inject poison into his vein, they couldn't find a way in. For nearly 2 hours, Miller sat there, feeling each needle prick his arms, legs, and hands. Finally, they hanged him upright, letting the blood flow freely, and then left him in the execution chamber. 30 minutes later, Miller was brought down, his wound stitched, and returned to his cell. This is Alabama's 3rd loss in 4 years. Miller's lawyer is now fighting to change the method of execution. as no one can ask a person to endure that pain a second time. As of today, Alan Eugene Miller is still alive, but if anyone holds the record for surviving the most times, it's John Smith. Smith was born in 1661 and served in the British Navy before becoming a thief and burglar. On December 5, 1705, he was sentenced to death. After 15 minutes of hanging, the family screamed in protest, and Smith was lowered alive. He was pardoned in February 1706. But Smith didn't learn his lesson. He reoffended and was arrested a second time, but escaped due to legal complexities. The third time, the prosecutor died exactly 1 day before the trial. For the fourth time, in 1727, at the age of 66, Smith was arrested for stealing a padlock. This time, he won't get away. Smith was sentenced to exile in Virginia. He begged for physical punishment instead of being separated from his family, but the mayor refused. No one knows what happened to Smith after that, but it is hoped that luck was still on his side. And Joseph Samuel, a German man sentenced to death in Australia in 1803 for killing a police officer, survived 3 hangings. The first time, the rope broke. The second time, the noose loosened. The third time, the string broke again. The crowd watching became violent, shouting for Samuel's release. The governor was summoned to the scene, inspected the rope, which showed no signs of being cut, and agreed with the crowd that this was a sign from God. The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. And finally, Weslao Miguel, the Mexican soldier who was executed by firing squad in 1915 after the Mexican Revolution. Miguel was shot 8 to 9 times in the body, followed by a shot to the head at close range, coup de grace, to ensure death. But Miguel is still alive. He faked his death, then crawled 3 blocks through the night to St. James Apostle Church, where a parishioner found him and cared for him until he recovered. Miguel may be scarred and disfigured forever, but he survived. These stories raise profound questions about the morality of capital punishment, human fallibility, and the delicate boundary between science and fate.